Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
All right, so let's dive into this kind of fascinating thing that happened during the hurricanes in North Carolina.
Yeah.
We're talking Starlink, Elon Musk, and whole lot of government bureaucracy that went down very publicly. So the big question
Yeah.
was Starlink really blocked from helping out?
Mm-hmm.
And does this show us a problem
Mm.
with how we think about utilities,
Mm-hmm.
especially during emergencies?
It definitely brings up some important questions about how we're getting ready for the future of disaster response.
Yeah,
We've got this incredible tech
right.
with huge potential to keep people connected when they need it most.
Exactly.
But we're also dealing with,
Mhm.
all these old rules and procedures that might not be up to speed yet.
Yeah, it feels like those two things are clashing a bit.
Absolutely.
And it got kind of
Yeah.
heated, right? On
Yeah.
X,
Yeah.
formerly Twitter, Elon Musk and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg
Oh, yeah.
were going back and forth. Musk was saying Starlink was being held back from helping hurricane victims.
Right.
And he even quoted one of his engineers
Oh, wow.
who said they couldn't get clearance to land a helicopter to deliver equipment.
Oh, wow.
Like they had the stuff ready to go,
Right.
but couldn't get it there.
Mm.
Musk even went so far as to ask Buttigieg straight up,
Yeah.
are you saying this man and hundreds of others are lying?
Wow, that's a really powerful quote.
Right.
It gets to the heart of the tension here.
Yeah.
You've got Musk, who's all about moving fast, breaking things, getting things done,
Right.
wanting to get Starlink up and running ASAP to help people.
Yeah.
And then you've got government agencies like FEMA and the FAA,
Right.
who are responsible for coordinating everything and making sure things are safe in a chaotic situation.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit.
Sure.
What exactly do FEMA and the FAA do in a situation like this?
Yeah.
And why would they even need to be involved with Starlink?
So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency,
Right.
they're basically the quarterback of the whole disaster response. They handle
Yeah.
everything from search and rescue to cleaning up debris to finding shelter and aid for people who lost their homes.
Right.
So they need to know exactly what's happening, and that includes who's operating in the disaster zone and what they're doing.
Makes sense. So they need to be aware of everything.
Exactly.
And the FAA.
The FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration.
Right.
They're all about air traffic control, making sure all flights are safe,
Okay.
which is even more important in a disaster zone
Yeah.
when you've got tons of aircraft in a small area.
Yeah, I imagine.
Think about it. Rescue helicopters,
Yeah.
planes bringing supplies, drones checking out the damage.
Right.
It's a very busy airspace.
Yeah, so keeping that organized is critical.
No, absolutely.
So the FAA would be concerned about
Yeah.
Starlink just sending in helicopters without talking to them first,
Exactly.
especially if they're landing in areas that are already crowded with other aircraft.
Right. Their main job is safety, and they've got strict rules and procedures for a reason. Even with the best intentions, an unauthorized flight could really mess things up.
Wow.
Could disrupt rescue operations, even cause collisions.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So it sounds like in this specific case,
Right.
Musk's team was ready with Starlink,
Mm.
but they hit a snag because of all these bureaucratic hurdles.
Yeah, that's right.
And this brings us to this interesting question, right?
Yeah.
Do the existing deregulation laws for utilities, the ones meant to make things easier for traditional utilities,
Mm.
especially in emergencies, do those apply to Starlink in this situation?
Mm.
Because Starlink is providing a vital communication service, right?
Right.
Just like a phone company or an internet provider.
Yeah.
So shouldn't it fall under the same rules that are
Yeah.
supposed to make sure these services are available when people need them most?
That's the argument some people are making, and it's
Yeah.
definitely worth exploring further. Because
Right.
if those existing laws don't apply to Starlink, then we might need to rethink how we regulate these new technologies, especially when it comes to disaster response.
Does the fact that Starlink operates in space complicate things even further? We're not talking about power lines or cables underground.
Right.
This is a whole network of satellites orbiting the Earth.
That's a great point,
Right.
and it definitely adds another layer of complexity from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay, so we've got this clash
Yeah.
between a company wanting to provide aid
Mhm.
and government agencies trying to ensure safety and coordination.
Yeah.
So, what happened next? Did Starlink actually get blocked, or were they able to deploy and help people?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Despite that very public back and forth
Yeah.
between Musk and Buttigieg, it seems like they found some common ground.
Really? So it wasn't a total standstill?
No, not at all.
Okay.
In fact, Musk actually thanked Buttigieg publicly for expediting approval for support flights
Wow.
shortly after their exchange on X.
So they worked it out.
It seems like they were able to communicate directly, maybe even by phone,
Okay.
and work out a way for Starlink to provide service while still addressing the FAA's safety concerns.
So maybe a classic case of making a mountain out of a molehill.
Maybe, or maybe it was the public pressure
Yeah.
that forced a quicker resolution. But I think it goes deeper than that.
Okay.
This whole incident really shows us the challenges we're going to face more and more as technology evolves faster than our regulations.
Right.
We have to figure out how to balance the need for speed and agility in emergencies with the need for oversight and accountability.
Absolutely. It's not just about Starlink or hurricanes.
Right.
This is a bigger conversation
Yeah.
about how we prepare for the future of disaster response
Yeah.
in a world where technology plays a vital role.
Exactly. We need to start thinking about how to create a more adaptable regulatory framework.
Yeah.
One that can accommodate these new technologies and ensure that they're being used responsibly and effectively to help people.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little further.
Sure.
What are some of the specific challenges we're facing when it comes to regulating these new technologies, especially in the context of disaster relief? And what are some potential solutions that we could be exploring?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is simply the speed of innovation.
Yeah.
These technologies are changing so rapidly
Right.
that it's hard for regulators to keep up.
Right.
By the time they figure out how to regulate one technology, something new comes along. Something even more disruptive is already here.
So it's like we're always playing catch up.
In a way, yes.
Right.
And that creates a lot of uncertainty for both the companies developing these technologies and the government agencies trying to regulate them. It can also create situations like we saw with Starlink, where companies are ready to deploy solutions, potentially life-saving solutions, but they're held back by rules that were designed for a different time.
So what can we do about it? I mean, we can't just throw out all the rules and let companies do whatever they want, especially when it comes to things like air traffic control.
Of course not.
Right.
But I think there are a few things we can do
Okay.
to create a more adaptable and responsive system.
Okay.
First, we need to be more proactive about regulation. Instead of waiting for something to go wrong and then reacting, we need to anticipate potential issues and come up with solutions in advance.
So more like a future-proofing approach to regulation.
Exactly.
Okay.
We need to be thinking about what the next generation of technologies will look like
Right.
and how we can create a regulatory environment that encourages innovation while also ensuring safety and accountability.
Makes sense. Are there other key areas we should focus on?
I think it's also crucial to foster a more collaborative relationship between the private sector and government agencies.
Okay.
Traditionally, there's been a bit of an adversarial dynamic with companies pushing the boundaries and regulators trying to rein them in.
Right.
But when it comes to disaster response, I think we need to move toward a more partnership-oriented approach.
So more open communication
Right.
and a shared understanding of goals.
Exactly.
Okay.
Companies like SpaceX, they have a lot of expertise and resources that could be incredibly valuable in a disaster.
Right.
And government agencies, they have the authority and experience
Right.
to coordinate large-scale response efforts.
It sounds like that kind of direct communication between Musk and Buttigieg might have been what ultimately led to a resolution. Maybe that's a good model for how these kinds of situations can be handled in the future.
It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
It shows how important it is to have clear communication channels and established ways for private companies and government agencies to work together effectively in emergencies.
Okay. So we've talked about proactive regulation, fostering collaboration, and clear communication protocols. Anything else we should add to our list of potential solutions?
One more thing that's important.
Yeah.
Public education and awareness.
Okay.
The more people understand about these new technologies and how they can be used in disaster response, the better equipped we'll be as a society
Yeah.
to make informed decisions about how to regulate them and integrate them into our emergency response plans.
So kind of like demystifying the technology
Yeah.
and making it more accessible to everyone.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
these technologies are tools.
Right.
And like any tool, they can be used for good or for bad.
Right.
It's up to us to decide how we want to use them.
And how we ensure they're used to benefit everyone,
Precise.
not just a select few.
And that brings us back to Starlink.
Yeah.
And whether it should be treated as a utility.
Right.
This isn't just an abstract legal debate. It has real-world consequences for people who rely on these services, especially in times of need.
Right, because if Starlink is considered a utility, it would be subject to a whole set of regulations designed to ensure fair access, reasonable pricing, and a certain level of service quality. But if it's not considered a utility, then it might operate more like a private business with more freedom to set its own terms.
Exactly.
And that could have a huge impact on people's ability to access this technology during a disaster.
Right, especially in rural areas or places that haven't had good internet options.
Absolutely.
Those places might not be as attractive to a company looking to make the most money.
That's right.
So where do we go from here? It seems like we're still trying to figure out how to regulate these new technologies and ensure that they're being used in a way that benefits everyone.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
But I think the first step
is to start asking the right questions.
Okay, like what?
What is the role of government in regulating these new technologies? What are the rights and responsibilities of private companies?
Right.
And most importantly, how do we make sure these technologies are being used to promote the common good?
Okay, those are some big questions.
They are.
But I think it's important that we don't avoid them.
I agree.
As technology keeps evolving so fast, these are the questions that will shape the future of our society.
Absolutely.
And it's not just up to policymakers and regulators to figure this out.
Right.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future we want to see.
Exactly.
So, to our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this whole Starlink situation? Do you think it should be treated as a utility? And what do you think the government's role should be in regulating these new technologies? Let us know in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.
Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together. And the choices we make today will determine the kind of world we live in tomorrow.
Yeah, those are some good things to think about.
And that's a critical point. You know, when we're talking about essential services like communication, especially in a crisis, it's not just about fancy tech. It's about fairness and access for everyone.
Yeah, you're hitting something I've been thinking about. We keep talking about Starlink acting like a utility. But do those deregulation laws that are already in place for traditional utilities, you know, the ones meant to get things back up and running quickly after storms, do they even apply to something as unique as Starlink?
It's really uncharted territory. Those laws were written with things like power companies and phone lines in mind. The whole system assumes a certain way of doing things. And Starlink just doesn't fit neatly into that.
Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Starlink is considered a utility in this case. What kind of regulations would they have to follow? And how might that affect their ability to respond quickly during a disaster?
Well, one major thing is this idea of common carrier obligations.
Okay.
This means that a utility has to provide service to anyone who asks for it, no matter where they are or how much money they have.
Okay.
So think about that with Starlink. Could someone in a really remote area where it's super expensive for Starlink to reach, could they demand service? Could Starlink say no just because it wouldn't be profitable?
Wow, that's a tough one. Sounds like those traditional utility rules might create some real logistical and financial headaches for a satellite internet provider.
Exactly. And then there's net neutrality, which we've been debating for years with wired internet providers.
Right.
If Starlink becomes the big player, especially in areas with limited choices, could they start prioritizing their own stuff? Like, imagine if they slowed down Netflix to make their own streaming service faster.
That would be a huge problem. Not just for competition, but potentially for free speech, too. We depend on the internet for so much now. Education, healthcare, even political organizing. If one company has that much power, it could really control how we use this essential tool.
Exactly. And that's what makes this Starlink situation so interesting and maybe a bit unsettling. It makes us face some really big questions about how we regulate these new technologies that blur the lines between private business and public necessity.
It's like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
The old rules don't quite work anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but we haven't figured out what the new rules should be.
You've got it.
And the stakes are high.
They are.
We're talking about access to information,
Yeah.
freedom of communication,
Right.
and
Yeah.
being able to respond effectively to disasters. Okay, so let's talk about solutions.
Okay.
We've established that the current regulations might not be the right fit for something like Starlink.
Mhm.
So what are our options? Can we create a whole new category of regulations just for satellite internet providers?
That's definitely a possibility. We could have a separate set of rules that take into account the unique challenges and opportunities of satellite internet, while still making sure essential services are provided fairly to everyone.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, it might involve things like setting minimum standards for coverage and reliability, making sure it's affordable for low-income households, and preventing things like throttling or favoring certain content.
So a more tailored approach that recognizes the differences between satellite internet and traditional utilities.
Exactly. It would take a lot of careful consideration and collaboration between policymakers, regulators, and the industry itself.
Are there any other options?
Another approach could be to adapt the existing utility regulations to better include satellite internet. This might mean clarifying definitions, granting exemptions in certain cases, or creating specific rules for disaster situations.
So we wouldn't necessarily start from scratch,
Sure.
but make adjustments to the current system.
Right. The goal would be to find that balance between encouraging innovation and making sure these technologies are being used responsibly for the benefit of everyone.
This all seems so complex. How do we even begin to tackle an issue with so many different aspects?
It is a daunting task,
Yep.
but I think the most important thing is to start having these conversations now before we find ourselves in another crisis where vital services are delayed or denied because of regulatory uncertainty.
Yeah, I agree. This isn't just theoretical. It has real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. And this is going to require a collective effort from everyone involved. Policymakers, regulators, industry leaders, and the public. We need to work together to create a future where technology helps humanity rather than the other way around.
And part of that is
Yeah.
making sure everyone has a say in these discussions. We need to hear from the people who are most likely to be affected by these technologies. People in rural areas, low-income communities, and those who depend on these services for their livelihoods and safety.
I couldn't agree more. The goal is to create a system that's fair, equitable, and responsive to everyone's needs.
Okay, so we've talked about creating a new regulatory category for satellite internet, adapting existing regulations, and the importance of public engagement. What else should we be thinking about as we move forward?
One crucial factor is international cooperation. Satellite internet crosses borders. We need to think about coordinating regulations and standards globally to make sure things are consistent and prevent a fragmented approach.
Yeah, makes sense. We can't have Starlink following totally different rules in different countries. That would be chaos, and it could really hinder their ability to provide service.
Right. It would also create an uneven playing field where some companies might benefit from more relaxed rules in some places.
So we need a global framework that makes sure everyone's playing by the same rules and encourages responsible innovation while also protecting the interests of consumers and citizens worldwide.
Precisely. And that's going to take a lot of diplomacy and collaboration between countries.
It sounds like a pretty big shift in how we think about regulation. It's not just about national borders anymore. It's about global cooperation and a shared understanding of how these technologies will shape our future.
And that's a really exciting prospect, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have this amazing opportunity to use technology to create a more connected, equitable, and resilient world. But it's going to require us to think differently, work together, and embrace new approaches to regulation and governance.
That's a powerful message. We've talked a lot about the challenges and potential solutions. But what about the human side of this? How are these technologies actually impacting people's lives, both during disasters and in everyday life?
That's a question we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive. We'll hear from people who have experienced firsthand the benefits and the challenges of satellite internet. And we'll dig into the broader societal impacts of this rapidly evolving technology.
Okay, so we've really covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
From that kind of crazy back and forth between Elon Musk and Secretary Buttigieg to all the regulatory challenges of satellite internet.
Right.
And even the potential for global cooperation. But I think it's important to bring things back down to earth, so to speak,
Yeah.
and talk about, the human impact of all this.
Absolutely.
Behind all the tech talk and policy debates, there are real people
Right.
whose lives are being changed by this technology,
Right.
both in good ways and sometimes in challenging ways.
That's right.
I'm really interested to hear about those experiences. Can you give us some examples of how satellite internet is making a difference in people's lives, especially in areas that haven't had good internet options in the past?
One powerful example is education. Imagine a student in a really remote area who's never had access to high-speed internet before. Suddenly, with Starlink, they can take online classes, explore huge libraries of information online, and connect with teachers and other students from all over the world. It completely changes their educational opportunities.
Yeah, it's like breaking down a barrier that's
Yeah.
been there for generations.
Mm.
Suddenly, all these resources that used to only be available to people in cities are now accessible to anyone with a Starlink dish.
Exactly, and it's not just about formal education either.
Yeah.
Satellite internet can also give people access to healthcare,
Oh, right?
especially in places where there aren't enough doctors.
Yeah.
Think about telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, even mental health counseling. These services can be so much more effective with a good internet connection.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about the potential of technology to bridge those gaps and bring essential services to people who might otherwise be isolated.
It is, and then there's the economic impact.
Oh, yeah.
Small businesses in rural communities can suddenly connect with customers and suppliers worldwide. Farmers can access up-to-the-minute data on weather patterns and crop prices. Remote workers can contribute to the global economy without having to move to a big city.
Wow.
It's creating new opportunities and empowering people in ways we couldn't even imagine a few years ago.
It sounds like satellite internet is really changing things for the better, especially for communities that have been left behind digitally for so long.
It really is, but we also need to be honest about the challenges.
Right?
This technology is still new, and there are issues with reliability, affordability, and even potential impacts on the environment that need to be addressed.
Right. We don't want to solve one problem,
Right.
only to create a bunch of new ones.
Exactly.
Right.
And there are concerns about data privacy and security, too.
Yeah, especially as we become more and more dependent on satellite internet.
It's not just about celebrating the good stuff. It's about being aware of the downsides and working to prevent them.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to regulation. Right? How do we create rules that encourage innovation and access
Yeah.
while also protecting consumers,
Yeah.
ensuring fair competition,
Yeah.
and addressing those bigger societal concerns?
It's a tricky balance, and there's no perfect solution. But I think it's a good sign that we're having these discussions. It shows that we're starting to understand the complexities of this technology and what it means for our future.
And it's important to remember,
Yeah.
this is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Technology is always changing,
Right.
and so is our understanding of its effects.
Exactly.
We need to be flexible, willing to learn, and committed to finding solutions that work for everyone. So, going back to that Starlink incident, do you think that was a wake-up call in a way? Did it make us face these bigger questions about technology, about needing updated regulations,
Yeah.
and about the importance of global cooperation?
I think it definitely sparked a lot of these conversations.
Yeah.
It put satellite internet on everyone's radar, and it showed the potential conflicts between innovation, regulation, and the public good.
It also showed that these aren't just theoretical issues. They have real-world consequences, especially in emergencies when people are depending on these technologies.
Absolutely, and I think it's safe to say that we're still figuring all this out.
Right.
But the important thing is we're talking about it, asking the tough questions, and working towards solutions that will benefit everyone in the long run.
So to wrap things up for our listeners, we want to leave you with this thought. The future of technology isn't set in stone. It's something we're creating every day with the choices we make, the conversations we have, and the actions we take.
Be informed, be engaged, and be part of the solution. The future is ours to create.
And on that note, we'll sign off. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Starlink, hurricanes, and all the ways technology, regulations, and the human experience are intertwined. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the fascinating and impactful developments shaping our world to fear.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.